Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ray Perman, and I'm director of the David Hume Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We have a very interesting and challenging evening ahead with Adair Turner, an old friend of the Institute, spoken here previously. Lord Turner of Eccleswell. I thought that was bound to be somewhere near Ecclefechan, but it turns out to be in Hampshire, I think, near Watership Down, so I'm told. So, Lord Turner has been many things in his career: an economist, an investment banker, a McKinsey consultant, but we'll forgive him for that. And the first time I met him, we were both trustees of the environmental charity WWF, and in fact, his interest, long-standing interest, in the environment led later to him being chair of the Climate Change Committee. But it is, of course, as chair of the Financial Services Authority that he is best known. He's written that 2 weeks before he accepted the job in 2008, he had no idea, and nor had most other people, that we were on the edge of the biggest financial disaster for probably a century in that time. But his experiences during that crisis and his thinking since then have informed his new book, Between Debt and the Devil, and it is that subject which he's going to talk about this evening. We're very privileged, too, to have Merryn Somerset-Webb to chair the question and answer. Merryn has a background both in stockbroking and investment banking, but is more recently a very successful journalist, editor-in-chief of Money Week, which is a personal finance magazine, but also a regular Saturday columnist in the Financial Times, and in my view, a must-read Saturday columnist in the Financial Times. If you don't already read Merryn, then do from now on, I recommend it. But I'm going to hand over now to Adair Turner.
Ray, thank you very much. It's a delight to be back here in Edinburgh. What you didn't mention is I was actually brought up in Scotland. I was brought up in East Kilbride, went to school in Glasgow. I don't often come back, but my sister still lives in Argyll, and it's a great pleasure always to come back to Scotland. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Royal Society. I am actually a fellow of the Royal Society here in Edinburgh, and it's a particular pleasure to be talking under the auspices of the David Hume Institute, because I'm going to be talking about money and credit and purchasing power and what that does to the economy. And of course, David Hume wrote incredibly insightfully about that 250 or more years ago. He was a crucial figure in the emergence of the quantity theory of money. But also, I think a crucial thing to say about David Hume was that he was somebody who wrote about economics, but he also, like Adam Smith, wrote about moral philosophy, about history, about the nature of politics, about ethics. And I think what both Adam Smith and David Hume illustrate is the importance of placing economics within a wider set of the social sciences and the areas of moral philosophy. And that is something which economics as a discipline, I think, has lost to a great deal over the last 50 years. It has become an overly mathematical, narrow discipline, and it could learn a lot from going back from the breadth of the vision which informed those great Scottish writers, economists and philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment. I'm going to talk about my book, Between Debt and the Devil, and what I want to do in the next 40 minutes is basically tell you what it says. I became chairman of the UK Financial Services Authority, very specifically on the morning of Saturday, the 20th of September, 2008. Now, those of you who remember, and I doubt if many of you remember it as precisely as I do, the timing of the financial crisis will know that only 5 days before Lehman Brothers had collapsed, only 4 days before the big insurance company and speculator in the CDS market, AIG, had been rescued by the US government. And so as I walked into the FSA, I was aware that I was going into an entire global financial system which was in the process of collapsing. It was rather like being appointed captain of the Titanic after you've hit the iceberg, but before you've actually sunk. And so my time and the time of all of us in financial regulation and central banking in the course of autumn 2008 was focused very much on crisis management, on how what were the actions we needed to take, the government, the central bank, Bank of England, and we, the regulator, together, to make sure that the fall of one domino didn't lead to another domino and another domino and an entire collapse of the banking system. But when we got through that process of the crisis management period, by, let's say, January 2009, we were fairly confident that we had stabilized the system, and our attention then turned to what did we need to do to stop it happening again? And I then became very closely involved for 4 years in all the global debates about the re-regulation of global finance. That process was driven by a thing called the Financial Stability Board, which at that time was chaired by Mario Draghi, now at the ECB, and I was chair of the major policy committee, which was designing what we're going to do on bank capital, on the rules on how you resolve banks, how you get around the problems of banks which are too big to fail, and lots of very techie stuff that we debated in windowless rooms in Basel about the details of financial regulation. And I actually think we did a pretty good job. And I think that the financial system itself now is far less likely to produce a sudden catastrophic crisis in the way that it did in summer and autumn 2008. I think what we've done to create a better capitalized banking system, a more liquid banking system, I think those are good and effective things insofar as they go. But as we progressed with that agenda, I became increasingly convinced that we were really skimming the surface of our understanding of why 2007 to 8 crisis had occurred, and in particular, why it proved so difficult to recover from that crisis of 2008. And I do want to stress that point, that one of the really striking things of the last 7 years is how far we are behind where we thought we'd be in 2009. If you look at all of the economic forecasts from the Bank of England, the Treasury, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank in 2009, the Federal Reserve, the ECB, none of them anticipated how slow and weak recovery would be. And as a result, nobody in the official sector, but also pretty much nobody in the financial markets, anticipated that interest rates were going to stay at close to zero for 7 years' time. If in the financial markets you had known that, you'd have made an awful lot of money if you'd worked out how to use that information for speculation, but almost nobody did. There was an almost complete failure to realize what an extraordinary impact on the process of growth would be. And the way to think about that is, in the UK, we have grown since 2009, but GDP per capita, income per capita in the UK, is only just a few percentage points now above where it was in 2007. This is almost a decade of no growth in average living standards. That is really quite remarkable in the history of market capitalism. If you look at the last almost 200 years of UK data, which have been set out by a wonderful economic historian called Angus Maddison, what it shows is that over those 200 years, a decade without any growth in average living standards has only previously occurred in war times. So this is a very major setback to what we thought was the inevitable process of market economy success, that although it might have its ups and downs year by year, once you got to a decade-long process, you could be sure of significant prosperity increase. So why has this occurred? I argue in the book that the single most important fact that you should look at to understand why the crisis of 2008 occurred and why we find it so difficult to recover is the increase in debt, and here I'm meaning not public debt, but private debt, private credit as a percent of GDP in the advanced economies. In 1950, on average, across all the advanced economies together, the ratio was 50%. Private debt, corporate and household, as a percent of national income, GDP, was 50%. By 2007, that ratio had reached 170%. And it grew pretty much every single year from 1950 to 2007, and it grew at a significantly accelerating pace after about 1990. Now, what's interesting about that growth in private credit, or leverage as we call it, is that at the time, this raised very little concerns among finance theorists and macroeconomists. If you went to finance theorists in universities or policy institutes, most of them would give you all the reasons why financial deepening, as it was called, more finance within an economy, was a good thing. And in particular, why we needed more credit to GDP. There was a lot of analysis of why it was probably the case that we would never have had the Industrial Revolution if we tried to organize it entirely on the basis of equity investments, why we needed debt and banks as well. And there was a lot of econometric analysis, mathematical analysis, which said, look, we can find correlations from the past that says if a country like India in 1970 only has debt to GDP of 10%, it doesn't grow as fast as it would have grown if it had had debt to GDP of 30%. So the assumption of the finance theorists broadly was more finance and more debt is good, and it's good sort of limitlessly. There isn't a point at which more debt starts being a bad thing. If you then went down to the other end of the academic corridor, as it were, to where the macroeconomists and the monetary theorists sit, the people who think about cycles in the economies and rates of inflation, their broad attitude was that this growth of leverage was just of no importance to them whatsoever. Because modern monetary economics, to an extraordinary extent, had developed a set of theories in which you could ignore the financial system. I mean, in retrospect, this is just bizarre. You might think, well, what an odd thing to do. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that interest rates work via the financial system. But broadly speaking, the models which economists have developed of the way the monetary economy worked, they're called dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models, really didn't have a banking system in them. And the central banks had gravitated to the belief that as long as we secured one objective, which was low and stable inflation, by pulling one instrument, which was the policy instrument, bank rate, then everything would be fine. And whatever was going on in the financial sector, that must be fine because, well, the finance theorists said it was fine, and it was of no particular interest to the monetary theorists. Now, what's interesting about that attitude, which is that this growth of leverage was either neutral, unimportant, or positively welcome, is that it might have been true if what we say in economic textbooks about debt and banks were true. If you were to go back this evening, I wouldn't actually recommend this, and to read an undergraduate economics textbook, unless you suffer from insomnia, that is. But if you were to do that, you would find that when you get to the bit that describes banks, broadly speaking, what it says is banks take money from depositors, by implication money that already exists, and they lend it onto businesses to finance investment. And by doing that, they allocate scarce resource of capital within the economy between alternative capital investment projects. That's what we say banks do. Unfortunately, as a description of what banks do in modern economies, that is pretty much a fictional account. It's fictional in two respects. First of all, it's vital to understand that banks do not just take pre-existing money and lend it on. They create credit, money, and purchasing power. They create money that didn't previously exist. And if we don't understand that, we really don't understand something which is absolutely central to the way that a modern monetary economy works. And what's interesting about that is there's a lot of early 20th century economists, like the Swedish economist Wicksell, like Friedrich von Hayek, the famous Austrian economists like John Maynard Keynes, who recognised that and wrote about it and worried about it, and then broadly speaking it disappears from our economic theories from about 1960s onwards. Banks create credit, money and purchasing power, and therefore it depends crucially to whom they allocate that credit, which is matched by money and purchasing power. And if you look empirically at to whom banks in modern economies, advanced rich economies, lend money, only about 15% of bank loans go to that thing which our economic textbooks say they do, which is to businesses to fund new investment. The majority of funding by banks funds either consumption, enabling people to consume earlier than they otherwise would, or, crucially, it funds real estate. Sometimes that means real estate investment, but above all, it tends to mean a competition between ourselves for the ownership of assets, real estate assets, that already exist. That is fundamentally what mortgage debt does. Britain has not built all that many new houses over the last 20 years, but we've had very strong cycles of more mortgage debt against a limited supply of housing, and in particular, the housing in the nice parts of town where everybody wants to live. So that is what banks do. And you may say, oh, well, Adair, that's just Britain. I mean, we all know British people are mad about houses and borrow money for houses. Well, that's not true that it's just Britain. There's some wonderful empirical analysis, which I quote in the book, by three economists, Alan Taylor and two colleagues, who've looked at the banking systems back to 1870 for the advanced economies. They've looked at what they actually do. And the way they sum up what they do is they say, from 1870 through to 1930 and through to 1970, the banks, broadly speaking, do what the textbooks say they do. Their core business is lending money to businesses to fund capital investment. But over the last 40 years, as they put it, they have become primarily real estate investors. And the way they sum it up, the role of banks in doing the textbook definition of banks, lending money to the real business sector to invest, is now a very small part of the business of banking today. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because if a large amount of lending is essentially funding the purchase of assets that already exist, and if those assets are in limited supply, because the most important thing about that asset is not actually the constructed value of the house, but the locationally specific scarce supply land on which the house sits, then when you extend more credit against it, the only thing that is going to give is the price. And what we observe in modern economies is these incredibly strong cycles between banks lend money to people to buy houses, the price of houses goes up. That then induces, in the mind of both the borrowers and the lenders, the idea that it would probably be a good thing to borrow and to lend some more money, and the cycle goes round again. It's a cycle that also works in commercial real estate, in offices, in hotels, etc., but it works in residential mortgages as well. And it turns out that that cycle between credit and the value of real estate, as empirical analysis by some very good economists at the Bank for International Settlement have shown, those cycles are not just part of the story of financial instability in modern economies. They are again and again what causes banking crisis and what blows up the economy. They are the cause of the Japanese banking collapse and the collapse of the economy in the early 1990s. They are the cause of the Scandinavian banking crisis of the early 1990s, Massachusetts in the late 80s, Texas in the early 80s. It is again and again credit and real estate. Why does that matter? It matters because as a result of those real estate cycles, you tend to get two problems. First of all, you get in some countries a real misallocation of resources in which, observing the increase in the price of existing assets, people then go out and build new housing or new commercial real estate in complete excess. A clear example of that is what happens in Ireland and in Spain in the 5 to 10 years before 2008. You get huge increases in the value of central Dublin real estate. So somebody says, well, it might be a good idea to borrow some more money to build all sorts of houses and hotels on the edges of town and in towns throughout Ireland. Ireland has 30,000 houses which are so completely surplus to requirement that they are pulling them down and returning the land to agricultural use. Spain has large numbers of provincial airports which are completely in excess of requirements. So you can get a real misallocation of resources. You suck labour force into the construction sector, and when the thing blows up, it's incredibly difficult to redeploy them to the rest of the economy. But even if you don't do that, what you can get with these build-ups of debt is that the debt gets to a level where when people lose confidence that this cycle is going to go on, you then have a response by debtors to attempt to pay back their debt, and it's that attempt which puts the economy into a recession. Now, we ought to have known this was going to occur with this huge build-up of debt, because before 2007-8, we had a canary in the mine, and the canary in the mine was called Japan. Japan in the 1980s had the biggest credit and real estate boom pretty much that the world's ever seen. This was a massive one. The total amount of credit extended by the banking system extended 2.5 times in 5 years. The value of central Tokyo property went up 4 times. And by the 1990, when the party came to an end, what you were left with was a whole load of companies, in this case it was companies, not individuals, who felt that they simply had too much debt. And they then tried to delever. They tried to pay down their debt. And they were so determined to pay down their debt that even when the Bank of Japan cut the interest rate to 0, they still said, but I've got too much debt already, because property prices have gone down 70% in the early 1990s. They've got all this debt that they borrowed to buy this property, hotels and office blocks, etc., shopping malls, things like that. And so they were determined to pay down debt. And what you then entered was an environment which would then which then pushed the Japanese economy into a recession, because those Japanese companies, determined to pay down their debt, cut their investment, and that drove the economy into a recession which the Bank of Japan's action of cutting the interest rate to 0 could make no difference to. And the good news, but also the problematic news, is that the thing that saved the Japanese economy at that point was that because there was a recession, the public sector moved into a massive deficit. The corporate sector was saving money in order to pay down its debt. The economy went into a recession, tax revenues went down, unemployment expenditures and other things went up. The deficits of the public sector soared, which was very useful because it offset the action of the private sector, and without it, Japan would have not had just 2 decades of very slow growth, it would have gone into a real 1930-style Great Depression. So that was a good effect, but with the inevitable effect that the debt didn't go away, it simply moved from the corporate sector to the public sector. So the story of Japan over the last 25 years is that corporate sector debt as a percent of GDP has gone down from 140% to 100% as the companies have all tried to delever, and public debt as a percent of GDP, government debt, has gone up from 50% to 250% and is still rising. And that's the fundamental problem with debt, that once we've accumulated too much of it, it sort of never seems to go away. It simply shifts around the economy. It's as if you're on a sort of waterbed where you deleverage and press down one side, and it's bound to go up on the other side, except this is a waterbed where the overall level of the water is going up and up and up. And that Japanese pattern, that once you have a crisis, when you've already got a very high level of debt, that the debt doesn't go away, it simply shifts around from the private to the public sector. That has just been repeated across all the other advanced economies over the last 7 years. In the UK, we've had a small amount of a reduction in household debt as a percentage of household disposable income, down from about 160% to 140%, but public debt as a percent of GDP has gone from 40% to 80%, and if it hadn't done that, we'd have been in a far deeper recession. But if you put the two together, private and public debt together, there is now more debt in Britain than there has ever been, except from some periods after the Napoleonic War and the Second World War, etc. Debt doesn't go away, it simply moves from the private to the public sector. And as I show in the book, that is the pattern which is shown across the developed world. And there's a fine report which came out 15 months ago, which I report shows the total level of debt across the advanced economies. The pace at which it's increasing has slightly slowed, but it's still going up and up and up. And total debt, public and private together, across the advanced economies is now higher than it has ever been. But debt has also moved across the world, and in particular after 2008, it moved to China. And what has happened in China over the last 7 years is not just something that happened internally in China, sort of by chance. It happened as a direct result of our financial crisis in 2008. The Chinese authorities in 2009 were aware that companies and households throughout the advanced economies were hitting the brakes, cutting their consumption, cutting their investment, because they felt over-leveraged, they felt they had too much debt. The Chinese authorities were terrified that that meant a fall in their exports, a fall in their employment in their manufacturing sector, and therefore a potential unemployment and political tension. So they decided to offset that by the only thing that they thought they could switch on soon, which was to unleash in China an extraordinary credit boom, which took debt in the Chinese economy from 125% of GDP to 220% of GDP and still rising, with that used to finance primarily the biggest construction boom the world has ever seen. And this has produced throughout China apartment blocks in what they call third and fourth tier cities, which will never be occupied. I mean, this is the equivalent of those 30,000 homes in Ireland, but multiply it 10 times, multiply it 100 times. Every now and then you hear sort of urban myths in debates, things which you'd like to be true because they're so interesting, but they're not quite true. But the following fact, as best I can tell, is true. That in 5 years after 2009, China poured more concrete than America did in the whole of the 20th century. That is the scale of the extraordinary construction boom they unleashed. But a lot of that construction is wasted on resources and assets that will never be used. It has produced huge overcapacity in the steel sector, in the cement sector, and that is now coming to an end. If you want to understand what's been happening in financial markets over the last week, this is the realization in the financial markets of just how deep is going to be the effect of China now saying, we've got too much debt and we've got to get it under control. So debt, once you have too much of it, doesn't go away. It simply shifts from the private to the public sector, or you can slow down the debt growth in one country, but then the global economy appears to need debt in other countries to keep it going. And the trouble with that is that appears to produce a situation in which all our classic policy levers are either ineffective, or they're blocked, or they have adverse side effects. So after the financial crisis of 2008, in the UK, we say, what are we going to do to keep the economy going? And originally, there was an agreement to have large fiscal deficits. And indeed, that was explicitly agreed at the meeting of the G20 in April 2009 in London. The leaders of the G20 agreed that everybody ought to run somewhat larger fiscal deficits to keep the economies going. And that is undoubtedly required in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. Otherwise, you'll go into a deep depression. But the problem after a while is you say, yeah, but hang on, what am I then going to do about the rising public debt level? You start worrying about that. So you then have fiscal consolidation or austerity to try and control the public debt. But then you've got the private sector still trying to pay its debt down, while the public sector is retrenching as well. And that will put you into recession, unless you think you can offset that by ultra-low interest rates. And the fundamental proposition of advanced economy policy over the last 7 years is we can do what's called fiscal consolidation. We can get the public deficits under control by raising taxes and increasing public expenditure. But the economy will still be kept going because we will have ultra-loose monetary policy. We will have interest rates which are zero, or indeed now in many countries, significantly negative. I mean, just think what an extreme thing that. In Switzerland, in Denmark, in Sweden, and in the European Union, the interest rate set by the central banks is now negative. It's not positive. It's you give me £100 and I'll give you back 99 at the end of the year. It's a negative interest rate. These are extreme policies. Then we've tried what's called quantitative easing, where the central banks buy long-term bonds in order to try and push down long-term bond yields. And let me be clear, if I'd been on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, I would have voted for those policies because I think they were better than nothing. But they have disadvantages. First, it's not quite clear how they get through to the real economy. Because when you think about it, once interest rates are already down at 1 or 2% for long-term bonds, how much difference is it going to be if through quantitative easing you bring them down from 2% to 1.8%? There aren't all that many businesses out there that are suddenly going to say, oh, I better go out and borrow some money and invest. But what low interest rates undoubtedly unleash is lots of fancy forms of financial engineering and risky games that people can play which build up financial stability risks. But above all, if it does work, these ultra-low interest rates, both short and long term, they can only really work by re-stimulating the very growth of private credit that first got us into this mess in the first place. So as levers to get us out of the mess, they're highly imperfect. Also, they tend to produce increasing inequality, and as I'll come back to later, it's pretty ironic that these policies of very low interest rates, because they put up the value of the assets that richer people own, it's a bit ironic that they create increasing inequality, because increasing inequality may be one of the reasons why we had far too much credit in the first place. So it's quite important that we don't get into this mess of over-leveraged, too much debt. And that suggests two issues for public policy. One is, what do we have to do to manage our economies so that we don't do this again? What should we have been doing in 1990 in order not to have too much debt in the system? And then, well, what on earth do we do given that we are in a sort of don't start from here situation? On the first, the fundamental economic issue which I address in the book is the following dilemma, the following question. If you look at the advanced economies from, say, 1990 to 2007, in monetary terms, on average, they look like this. What's called nominal GDP, the present price level of national income, tended to grow at about 4 or 5% per annum. And the central banks were very proud that they'd got it growing at about 4 or 5% per annum, because 4 or 5% growth in nominal income allowed a combination of about 2% real growth in line with the potential of the economy and 2% or so inflation. And there's very good theory to believe that economies work best with a level of inflation which is low but still positive, which is why we have an inflation target of 2%. So we had nominal GDP, nominal income, growing at about 4 or 5% per annum and growing relatively steadily. And people talk about the great moderation of what a nice, good story this was. The only trouble is that all the time that nominal GDP was growing at about 4 or 5% per annum, nominal credit, i.e. how much debt had been extended to households and companies, was tending to grow at about 10 or 15% per annum. But if nominal credit grows at 10 to 15% per annum, while income goes at 5% per annum, then in leverage terms, your numerator is growing faster than your denominator, and your leverage ratio is bound to go up and up and up. In formal economic terms, this is not an equilibrium. In common sense terms, it's going to blow up one of these days. And so the question is, can we have modern advanced economies which grow nominal GDP at, say, 5% per annum, but only on average over time grow credit at 5% per annum, so that it's some sort of equilibrium? Or is there something about our economies which seem to need, in order to grow, a pace of credit growth which eventually blows the system up? Now, I argue in my book that it is possible to have modern economies which grow in what economists would call equilibrium, with debt growing in line with rather than faster than national income. But I also argue that in order to achieve that, we have to address some really difficult fundamentals of the structure of the modern global economy, and we have to have a radically different approach to financial regulation. In terms of the fundamentals, I think there are three basic reasons why we have such credit-intensive economies. One is rising inequality. As we get rising inequality, more percentage of income going to the top 10%, but in particular even to the top 1% or the top 0.1%, it is an observable fact that richer people tend to save a higher proportion of their income. Well, obviously, because they've reached satiation in many things. They've got enough as much as they need. And therefore, as you become a more unequal society, unless something else gives, you might tend to have a shortage of demand because the richer people will be trying to save more money, but there aren't a set of immediate increased investment needs, so you have an excess of attempted savings over attempted investment, and you have what economists call the possibility of a secular stagnation, a long-term stagnation of demand. Unless that is, you've got a whole load of poorer people, people at the bottom end of the income distribution, who, for instance, in America, real wages in the bottom quarter of the population have not gone up for 30 years. A group of people who are attempting to still live the American dream, attempting to keep pace with what the advertisements are telling them is the lifestyle they should live. And how do they do it? Well, they do it by borrowing money. So the financial system picks up the excess savings of the rich and lends it to the poor in a process which Raghu Rajan, who's now the central bank governor of the Reserve Bank of India, he described what happened in the US before the crisis as essentially the following pattern. You've got rising inequality. The political system doesn't know what to do about that, how to offset it, whether to offset, a redistribution is unacceptable, you can't work out how to educate people out of it. So what do? Well, you basically say to the poorer people, as Raghu puts it in a wonderful chapter title in his book, he says, the answer is let them eat credit. And basically there was lending to less well-off people in America through the subprime mortgage market, lending them money they fundamentally couldn't afford to pay back, unless that is, house prices went up, which then enabled them to refinance the loan every 3 or 4 years. But that was unsustainable, and eventually it blew up. So inequality is one of the fundamental drivers of why we have a credit-intensive economy. The second is the existence of very major imbalances in the world between countries that save too much and countries that don't save enough. Germany is now running a current account surplus which is equal to 8% of its national income. This is amazing. German people are saying, we will on average get £100, and basically 8 of that we're going to invest somewhere in the rest of the world, not in Germany. We're going to run these huge surpluses. And China also has run huge surpluses as well. Well, it's simply a mathematical fact that if those surpluses exist, and unless they are fully matched by Germans or Chinese buying real property or equities overseas, they are bound to be matched by someone in another country taking on debt. That's just mathematics, you can't escape it. So there's a fundamental thing about why we have these huge current account surpluses and what we can do about it. And the third is the nature of the property market. There is something about modern economies where we tend to focus more and more of our income, and it's actually a logical thing to do, on competing with one another to be able to buy houses in the nicer part of town, but that tends to generate a credit-intensive economy. And there's a set of things that we need to address there about other things we can do in taxation, other things to do in the supply of housing, the ability to provide more housing that can change the nature of those cycles. So we need to address those cycles as well as to address financial regulation. But in terms of financial regulation, I argue for a much more radical reform of financial regulation than I was able to agree in those negotiations, those debates with my international colleagues in those rooms in Basel. We used to debate whether we should edge up the capital ratio for banks from, let's say, 7% to 7.5%. And there were hawks and doves in this debate. and by actually a strange bit of alphabetical chance, we used to sit around the table by alphabet, and all the hawks, which was the UK, the US, and Switzerland, were all together at one end of the table, and all the doves, which was actually France, Japan, and Germany, were all together at the other end of the table. So I was a hawk, but a hawk meant I was arguing for 8%, not 7%. If I were the benevolent dictator of an economy which could be designed and got right de novo without worrying about problems of transition, I would set bank capital ratios at 20%, not 7 or 8%. I think we have fundamentally over-leveraged banks. And I also think we ought to set capital ratios for lending against property far higher than we do. We can talk about that in questions. So those are some thoughts about how radical we have to be to change the nature of the economy not to end up in this mess in the first place. But we are where we are. What are we going to do about it? I think the first point is just to get to an analytical understanding of where we are. There is so much debt in the world today, private and public, that we are not simply going to grow out of it in the processes of gradual economic growth will get us out of it. Mathematically, one of about 3 or 4 things is going to have to occur. Either there are going to be big debt write-offs. People who say, you think I owe you £1 million, I'm sorry, I'm defaulting. And that's going to happen, again, to Greek public debt. Greece cannot pay back the debt. There is going to be another Greek debt restructuring. Or we are going to have many years in which the interest rate is below the inflation rate, which is a way of eroding the real value of debt over time. But you may then get in a treadmill where you never get out of the debt, because if the interest rate is below the inflation rate, that's a good way of eroding the value of the existing debt, but it also creates all sorts of incentives for people to borrow more money, so you never get out of it. Or you can do what's called monetization of debt. You can have the central bank essentially buy government debt and retire it. Now, you can argue which of those, or which combination of those, is going to occur, but I would suggest you're going to have to choose one of those. I believe, along with economists like Ken Rogoff, who wrote a very good book called This Time It's Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly, that you have to start by understanding that the debt burdens are so great, we're simply not going to grow out of them, and that we have to find our way to one or other of these radical options. And I have become controversial by suggesting that one that we should not exclude is what is called the monetization of debt. And what that would mean is that the Bank of England, having bought, as it has, 375 billion of government debt, would make it clear that it is going to hold that forever, in which case that government debt really isn't the debt of the government any longer, because the government owns the Bank of England. Think about when the Bank of England owns the debt of the government, but the government owns the Bank of England. Does the debt really exist? Why is that controversial? It's controversial because people say it will lead to hyperinflation. And that is the devil in my book title here. In about October 2012, Jens Weidmann, who is the president of the Bundesbank, gave a speech in which he got pretty close to suggesting that Mario Draghi, president of the European Central Bank, was growing a pair of horns. Because what Jens said is, look, this very worrying idea that the ECB is going to do quantitative easing. And he says, we know where that ends. And he quoted a very famous bit of German literature, which is part 2 of Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, in which the devil, Mephistopheles, tempts the emperor and says, Emperor, in your public expenditures, you don't have to be constrained by how much you can tax your people, or by how much you can persuade them to lend you money at interest, because you can print money against the security of the gold that we know is somewhere in the ground, even without picking up the gold. And Jens said, well, this was all very well, it started well, but after a while, the emperor said, oh, that was rather good, I'll do some more of it and some more of it and more of it, and it ended in hyperinflation. The essence of the economics of printing money and spending it, the central bank printing money and sending it, is that if you do it in a small amount, it will have a small and under some circumstances positive effect. And if you do it on a huge amount, it will have a hyperinflationary effect. In technical terms, it is completely doable. And indeed, some of the people who have supported doing money-financed fiscal deficits, the central bank printing money and giving it to the government to spend it, or buying the existing debt and writing the debt off, have been some quite surprising people. Probably the clearest statement of why, when we're in a deep deflationary cycle, we should use the possibility of what I call overt money finance, but he called helicopter money, was Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman, I assure you, would not support Jeremy Corbyn. Milton Friedman was not a socialist. Milton Friedman was certainly not interested in hyperinflation. But he argued in a number of articles that when you get into a deflationary trap, not only a way, but the safest and most direct and least risky way to get out of that deflationary trap was to print money and to spend it. Technically, it's entirely possible, but the danger is the political risk. The danger is that once we break the taboo against printing money, what's to stop politicians not doing it in appropriate small amounts in the appropriate circumstances, but all the time and in excessive amounts? And that is why we've created a taboo against even discussing what I call overt money finance. But here's the theme with which I end the book. I think we have to understand that there is no perfection out there, and that we have to choose between alternative imperfections. It is clearly potentially dangerous to say to governments that they should stimulate nominal demand by printing money and spending it, because they may print too much of it, they may spend it in an excessive and corrupt and inefficient fashion. So we've tended to end up over the last 50 years with a political economy which has a total taboo against governments printing and spending money, but is totally and utterly relaxed about how much credit, money, and purchasing power the private banking system creates. Because nominal demand growth is going to have to come either from what the government does in creating sovereign money, or what the private banking system does in creating private money. Because you're only going to get an increase in nominal demand from an increase in some category of money, the great insight, as it happens, of David Hume. And we have to realise that both those mechanisms to create more money and purchasing power, both of them are risky. And we have to proceed not with a political economy that places a complete and utter taboo against governments using the actions that are sometimes needed to get out of recession, but a complete confidence in the private sector, nor should we switch that round and have a complete confidence in the state and a complete suspicion of the private sector. We have to understand that we are caught between alternative imperfections, the imperfections of markets and the imperfections of the state, which is why the book is called Between Debt and the Devil. Thank you very much.
Well, we were promised challenging. I think we got challenging. I did, anyway. Right, I'm guessing there are an awful lot of questions out there, so let's begin. If you have a question, just stick your hand up, and then if you wouldn't mind giving us your name before you start talking, that would be great. And there are microphones on both sides. We've got the first one here, please.
I might stay standing up, actually.
Okay,
Yeah.
you do that.
Upstairs.
Craig Mackenzie, Aberdeen Asset Management. You alluded to the fact that China seems to have done a Spain and an Ireland and overbuilt huge amounts of excess capacity and misallocated resources on a epic scale. The difference, of course, is that the chickens have come home to roost for Spain and Ireland, and we've had a hugely disruptive period of pain and trauma as an attempt begins to resolve that. The chickens haven't yet come home to roost in China, although people are accepting that there are chickens there at last. What do you think is likely to happen? I mean, the scale of the China problem dwarfs the scale of the European problem.
Yeah.
Is this going to create the next global crisis, and how will it all end?
Well, I think this is the big story of the last year. There's one chapter in my book called Debt and Embezzlement, half of which is devoted to China, and I feel fairly good about the fact that even though I wrote that, last January, as you will see, it basically says something very big is about happening to China, because I think you only need to go there and look at the figures to understand the scale of the problem. So to give you an idea of what's occurred in China, from 2009 through to 2000 and today, debt to GDP, primarily lent to large state-owned enterprises and to various categories of local government, goes from 125% to 220% of GDP. I mean, it depends which figure you use, but on every figure it's gone up by getting on for 100%, and it is still rising, and it is still rising quite fast. That debt has fundamentally been used to drive an extraordinary investment boom. Even before this investment boom started, China was an outlier. It was investing 40 to 41% of GDP, and only, therefore, consuming, 60% of GDP. This is a level of investment which was already far higher than we had seen, for instance, by Japan or Korea at the peak of their rapid growth and huge investment processes. So this was an over-investment focused economy, and economists had been talking for years about China has to rebalance its economy away from investment and away from exports towards, consumption by the Chinese people. And then what happens under this boom from 2009 onwards is the investment ratio not only didn't come down, it went up. It went up from 41 to about 48% of GDP. We've never had a major economy ever before basically investing 48% of its national income, and this primarily going into infrastructure investment, apartment blocks, 6-lane highways, metro systems, convention centres, hotels, every third and fourth tier city in China telling you that, if it's a sort of if I build, they will come. If I build a museum and a sports centre and a convention centre and hotels, XYZ that you've never heard of is going to be the centre of the world. Well, unfortunately, that's not going to be true. I mean, Shanghai and Beijing and Shenzhen, they're fine, but there's a lot of places where there's been massive overbuilding. And that overbuilding was what drove the commodity supercycle. That's what drove the Australian economy through coal and iron ore, and the Brazilian economy and the Russian economy. And that process, that growth, is now unwinding. And the Chinese authorities fundamentally are struggling with the immensely difficult problem that you have at the end of this credit boom, which is you're terrified about letting it roll on, and you're terrified about stopping it. You're terrified about stopping it because if you send the message out to your banks that you're not to roll over that loan to, provincial city X or steel company Y, that steel company or that city is going to go bankrupt, and then there's going to be a shock to the system, and people are going to lose confidence, and people are going to be unemployed, etc. But the only way to stop it going bankrupt is to lend them more money, because they can't possibly afford to pay back the loans they've already got. So they can only pay back the loans they've already got by lending them more money. And if you look at the reaction of the Chinese authorities over the last 18 months, they're continually oscillating between, no, we're going to get tough, we've got to bring this to an end, we know we've got to have discipline, we know we've got to take some medicine and work it out, and then they do that for a couple of months, and then they get terrified, so they push the stimulus back again. And that's what's going on in China at the moment. But they can't stop a very major slowdown in the Chinese economy. There are big debates going on about what exactly is occurring in the Chinese economy. Are the figures right or not? But certainly there is a huge slowdown going on in industrial production. It's actually possible that industrial production in China, in the real figures, may have actually fallen last year. Industrial production. And that, of course, is what is then driving collapsing oil prices, collapsing iron ore prices, Brazil and Russia now in fairly deep recessions, big slowdown in Indonesia, and a slowdown in the global economy. Now, is it going to produce A financial crisis like 2008? Probably not, for this reason. There are huge debts out there. We are talking about the total debt burdens. The Chinese GDP is about $11 trillion. Debt to GDP is 220%. We're talking about $25 trillion of debt. But most of that debt is from Chinese state-owned enterprises and provincial governments to Chinese state-owned banks. So at the moment, the Chinese authorities have the ability to say, oh my God, we're in a mess, but we better do a big accounting exercise and knock some of this out and move the debt to the central government balance sheet. Relatively small amounts of this are held by, advanced economy investors. But here's the big risk with China. They are liberalizing their capital account, and they're committed to doing that. And as they do that, more and more of this immense debt burden will link in some way to banks or insurance companies or pension funds or hedge funds somewhere else in the world. So if you ran forward these scenarios and said, suppose in 2020 Chinese GDP were then 15 trillion, and suppose debt to GDP had got to 300%, which is 45 trillion of debt, and suppose through a liberalization of the capital flows in and out of China, that was linked in through all sorts of difficult to trace links into the global financial system, then that could produce a financial crisis that might look 2007, but really quite small.
Okay, there's a decisive answer for you. How will it end? Not well. Right, should we have one down here? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sam Walker. I'm shortly going to be at Alliance Trust Savings. I completely agree with your diagnosis. However, I'm almost wondering whether you're not being radical enough. I know that may be funny to say, but I've read part of your book, and I know you talk about the Chicago plan.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering why, for instance, you don't consider that to be a suitable option.
Yeah.
Because you didn't even mention it there as perhaps one of the solutions, which... In fairness, I mean, it nearly got approved in the 30s. It was quite close. I mean, we'd never have had this situation if that had been gone through the US Congress in the 30s. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And can I be greedy and have a second question as well?
If it's quick.
Yeah. Just, I wanted to get your thoughts as well on the lack of understanding amongst finance professionals on the money creation mechanism. I'm an accountant and a treasurer, and I had to learn about this stuff a few years ago. It wasn't taught to me. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the almost a scandalous admission of that in professional and academic qualifications.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, that's interesting.
Very good. You're quite right. I didn't in my talk mention what's in chapter 12, where I raised the question, should we abolish banks? I mean, I've made myself, there's enough of my sort of responsible conservative colleagues in central banks and governments around the world who already think I've sort of, gone slightly mad by talking about overt money finance. And there's only so many really radical ideas you can back before they decide you completely gone AWOL. But actually, I do discuss abolishing banks. For those of you who don't know this debate, a bank is what we call a fractional reserve bank. What does a fractional reserve bank mean? It means that although somebody who doesn't understand it at all might think that your money in the bank is backed by money in the vaults, of course it isn't. The vast majority of it is lent out. And only a small fraction, and this is why it's called fractional reserve banks, of the liabilities of the banks, the deposits of the banks, are held as reserves, either at the central bank as monetary reserves at the Bank of England or as notes and coins. And that's what's called by fractional reserve banks. And it's the fact that banks are fractional reserve banks, that they only have to hold a small proportion, a very small proportion, of the total money they create in absolute money. It's that factor which enables them to create credit, money, and purchasing power. If we didn't allow them to do that, they couldn't create credit, money, and purchasing power. If all they were a sort of national savings institution where you put your money in, but on the asset side, every £100 that you put in was, matched by a note and coin or a reserve at the Bank of England, they wouldn't be creating money, credit, and purchasing power because the total amount of money in the economy would be the notes and coins plus the reserves at the Bank of England. So fractional reserve banking enables them to create money, credit, and purchasing power. In the early 30s, a set of really quite remarkable people argued for the abolition of banks. And the reason why I say that they're remarkable is that several of them were, in all other respects, extreme free marketeers. People who believed, very strongly in capitalism, were bluntly, some of them suspicious of trade unions, suspicious of the role of the state. They believed in totally free markets, but they didn't think free markets would apply to banks. And indeed, Henry Simons is an interesting person. He was the absolute founding father of the Chicago School of Free Market Economics, a very hardline free marketeer. In all of the rest of his writing, said the following. He said, private initiative has been allowed too much freedom in determining the character of our financial structure and in directing changes in the quantity of money. In the very nature of the system, banks will flood the economy with money substitutes during booms and precipitate futile efforts at general equilibrium thereafter. So a group of economists, and he wrote that in 1936, a group of economists like Simons, Erling Fisher, Frank Ramsey, people who had observed what happened in America in the 1920s and then the collapse of the banking system and the Great Depression in the early 30s, said the core of this problem is fractional reserve banks. And Simons and others said that as long as we have these fractional reserve banks, they will go out and generate fantastic booms like the 1920s, but then it will blow up. And they said the only way to get around this is to abolish banks and have what's called 100% reserve banks. And they sent to President Roosevelt what was called the Chicago Plan. And the Chicago Plan said the banking system is in collapse. Why don't you use this as an opportunity to move to a 100% reserve banking system? And there has recently been a whole series of people who have resurrected this idea. There's a group called Positive Money who write about it. There's a very fine economist called Michael Kumhoff, who actually now does have a role at the Bank of England, who have been pushing the thing and saying, why don't we revisit the Chicago Plan? Why do we allow banks to create credit money and purchasing power at all? And I do consider that option in the book. Now, you're quite right. You've got to the bit where I say, but I'm not quite willing to go to that degree of radicalism. Why not? Well, first of all, I think there are some really intractable transition problems once you've got a large amount of debt in the economy about moving away from. Michael Kumhoff has written a paper where he argues that he solved those transition problems. I'm just not technically convinced by that. But more fundamentally, I actually do think that I would accept that banks can create some credit money and purchasing power, because if I don't accept that, I'm going to have to rely entirely on the government to create nominal demand. If you don't have a fractional reserve banking system, you'll only get an increase in nominal GDP through the government and the central bank printing money. And I'm a little bit worried about relying entirely on that. So I end up with a compromise position of I don't want an economy where we rely entirely for nominal demand growth on the creation of more sovereign money, but I don't exclude that as something we do when we're in a deflationary trap. And then over on the private side, I fundamentally argue, yes, we should have fractional reserve banks, but the fraction should be much, much bigger than we allowed it to be. Because once you've realised that we've got fractional reserve banks, and that it's not mad to have 100% reserve banks, you can choose as a piece of policy to have 10% fractions, or 20% fractions, or 25% fractions. And that is what I end up arguing for. And I hope it isn't that I'm just not willing to go all the way in terms of radicalism. But, as a sort of bit of establishment insider, I've gone quite a big way in radicalism already.
The second part of that question was about...
very good
Which is
question.
interesting.
So, I think it is extraordinary the way that modern economics has paid so little attention to the banking and credit system. And indeed, there are people who study economics who really don't internalize the understanding that banks create credit money and purchasing power. And this reflects a whole set of tendencies in modern economics which set in after about the 1960s and 70s. And where up until then, there were a whole series of people who wrote, and economists that people would read at university, which wrote about this. Knut Wicksell wrote a very fine book 100 years ago. He was a Swedish economist who wrote a book called Interest and Prices, which is all about how banks create credit money and purchasing power. Friedrich von Hayek absolutely fixated, as was the whole of the Austrian school, on how banks create credit money and purchasing power. Keynes, in the treatise on money, even more than in the general theory, very focused on this issue. There's writing about it in the 60s and 70s. There's some people called Gurley and Shaw who wrote some very insightful things then. And then it goes out of economics. Why does it go out of economics? Now, what I'm about to say, I think will astound you and horrify you, but I think part of it is that economists started wanting to be able to write economics in an entirely mathematically modelled fashion, which produced complete mathematically precise answers. And it turned out to be incredibly difficult to write models that solve to an equilibrium if they have a complicated banking system in it. So they decided not to have a complicated banking system in it. I mean, they also did the same on what is called the rational expectations hypothesis. The rational expectations hypothesis is a crucial piece of economic theory which develops in the 60s and 70s. And I mean, the trouble with the rational expectations hypothesis is if you describe it to most ordinary people, they think it's mad. It basically says that all of us, in the way that we think about the future, are entirely rational. And that we spend all our life developing ways of thinking about the way that markets work and the decisions we'll make and the decisions of other people's work, in which, as it were, we have rationally defined probability distributions of the way the future will be. And this is not how human beings, who are this funny psychological mix of rationality and emotions, actually operate in the real world. And it's not how most common sense people assume that human beings work, but it became the dominant form of the way that economics was done. It was done on the rational expectations hypothesis. And again, I think the really shameful part of this story is one of the reasons that economists were attracted by the rational expectation hypothesis was that it made the mathematics, as we call it, tractable. If you recognize that human beings are bundles of part rationality and part emotion, and if you recognize that the future, and this was Keynes's great insight, is governed by an inherent and irreducible uncertainty as to what will happen, it turns out incredibly difficult to do precise mathematical economics. So we decided, well, let's ignore the scrappy reality of partly emotional human beings in an uncertain world, and we'll have something which is mathematically precise, but as a way of describing what's about to occur, pretty much useless. So part of the answer to the Queen, who turned up to the London School of Economics and said, why didn't we see it coming, is that economists had developed models in which they couldn't possibly see a crisis coming because they'd made a set of assumptions in which a crisis was impossible, because in an entirely rational world, the crisis could never occur.
Can we have one here, please? And right here, red notebook. Thank you. And then when you've asked yours, if you'll just hand the microphone behind you, and we can do two at once. Thank you.
Andy Milne from SURF, an organisation that's concerned with people who are actually paying the debts that have been created by the banks in more disadvantaged areas. You talked a bit about China. I think there's an old Chinese proverb which says wisdom begins with naming things correctly. A connection between that and the reference to the devil, your reference to David Hume and ethics, and taking, I think, is it Sam's point, I want to try and ask you to go a little bit further, because I think I might be correct in quoting you saying that banks, to some degree, have been socially useless. Would that be correct? Yes? Over the piece. Okay. So, all right. Okay. Well, please do. But my point would be here that and that point you make about rationality. If the present system is not predicated on reality, it's important for us to be realistic about what it is that has happened here. Because it does seem to me that over the period since 2008, we have had the most astonishing turnaround in reality, whereby we now find the situation that sorry, the reality of this is that the problem is about ethics and politics. And I would like you to say something about power and politics, which has enabled us to turn around the reality of what it was that happened to a situation now where at a UK level and at a European level, we are backing off naming the reality of what has happened in the banking system in order to protect bankers who were making the most vulnerable people in the country pay for the debt.
Okay, let me try and step through the what I think you're saying there. Just in terms of what I said about socially useless, it was I think I did. It never has a very small circulation magazine received such an immediate boost as when, in an interview with Prospect magazine, which is very worthy, but not all that many people in the world read it. I said in answer to a question that some of the activities of the financial sector were socially useless. It ended up with headlines all over the world. I also asked for a payback for this free publicity that I'd given them. At the time, when I used the word socially useless, I was using it very specifically about the exotica of what was called the securitized credit system before the crisis. You may remember that before the crisis, clever investment bankers had managed to package up subprime loans and generate out of them what were called CDOs, credit default obligations. And there were CDS, credit default swaps. Collateralized debt obligations, CDOs. And there was CDS, credit default swaps. And indeed, having developed CDOs, which essentially take a package of loans and by some bit of apparent financial alchemy, create low risk and return slices and high risk and return slices, they decided that wasn't enough. They took one of those slices and then created out of that a CDO squared. And the point I would make was that if amid the turmoil of 2008, we had managed to mislay the instructions on how to create a CDO squared, it was unlikely that humanity would be worse off. We had ended up with a degree of financial engineering and complexity which clearly had no positive social value, and which by creating incredible complexity, which financial regulators couldn't really understand and the markets couldn't understand, created the conditions for extreme financial stability. And there's a new film on this out, a film of a great book. I mean, Michael Lewis's The Big Short, which I think is a magnificent book, and I hear the film is pretty good on it as well. So if you want to you go into some of the details of what occurred with that exotica. And that's what I was talking about at the time. But actually, as I say in the foreword for the book, I ended up believing that though that's important, and although there were some things we never needed at all, actually the biggest problems in the economy are created by the financial products which are good up to a point, but bad beyond that point, right? Yes, there were problems created by exotic CDOs, but there was too much mortgage debt. And here's the problem. A certain amount of mortgage debt, well, that's a good idea. I mean, mortgage debt lubricates the exchange of houses between people, between generations. I don't want a zero debt environment. I just think that if you create too much of it, you will blow the system up. And actually, for instance, if I was to look at the causes of the failure of HBOS and the fact that HBOS essentially had to be rescued with government money and then it was merged with Lloyds, etc. HBOS was a bank which was not, to any significant extent, into that exotica of securitized credit and derivatives. That is not. That's what brought Lehman Brothers down, but it's not brought HBOS down. HBOS was brought down by classic old commercial real estate lending, fairly straightforward loans against people who are developing hotels and shopping malls, etc., which our economy needs some of, but if we have too much of it, extended too rapidly and with insufficiently tight credit standards, it'll blow the system up. Now, let me then relate that to the problem of what do we do about it. And the point I make in a slightly controversial chapter of the book, there's a book called Irrelevant Bankers in an Unstable System. And I basically say in that chapter, yes, we ought to hold bankers to account if they do completely crazy things and don't manage the banks in a responsible fashion. Yes, we should have rules to prevent banks being able to fail and just dumping systems, their liabilities onto the onto the state. So yes, there is a sort of a set of ethical issues there, and yes, we ought to regulate the bankers' bonuses to make sure that they're not paid huge amounts of money before we can really work out whether what they've done is a very sensible profit-creating thing or an incredibly risky thing that's about to grow up. But don't overstate what we can achieve by punishing bankers, changing bonuses, changing the rules on default, because underlying it, there is a fundamentally unstable system if we allow too much debt. And it's actually a thought which was within Hayek. He actually said how nonsensical it is to formulate the question of the causation of cyclical fluctuations in terms of guilt and to single out the banks as those guilty. Nobody has ever asked them to pursue a policy other than that which gives rise to cyclical fluctuations, and it is not within their power to do away with such fluctuations, seeing that the latter originate not from their policy, but from the very nature of the modern organisation of credit. So although I partly agree with you that there is a set of ethical issues about individual behaviour and the professionalism with which banks are managed, I prefer to focus on the instability of the overall system, an instability which is bound to be there if we don't have enough capital in the system, if we don't have enough liquidity in the system, and if we don't use regulatory power to lean against credit and asset price cycles. What I think that suggests is that the biggest ethical requirement on bankers, and I think this is probably true in other areas of industry as well, is not just their own individual behaviour. It is not to misuse their potential lobbying power to argue against the regulations that we require to make the banking system more stable. And I think that is the really key thing about power and ethics. I think the way in which, in particular, in the US, money in the US political system was used to argue against regulations from the 1990s onwards, which might have helped stop the crisis, I think that's the much bigger, as it were, ethical issue than the misbehaviour of any one individual banker in their own particular bank. It's the design of the system which is fundamental, but there are ethical and power issues about why the system was designed in the way it was.
Okay, we had one right here, got the microphone already.
Thank you. My name is Bill Roger, and I'm possibly about to demonstrate my ignorance as a non-finance professional. It may lead on actually what you've just been describing, but I was coming back to this 20% capital ratio that you didn't succeed in getting. And I wondered whether a way of getting to that would be the separation of banking into retail and as a means of constraining and thereby increasing the ratio. The argument is always, as I understand it, that if we do that, then we can't deepen the financial pool, which I think is another way of saying that we would have to work with a higher capital ratio.
I'm not convinced that the separation of retail from wholesale is absolutely fundamental here. I mean, you can increase a capital ratio on a bank which is a universal bank, or you can increase it with a bank which you've divided into a retail bank doing SME lending and retail mortgages, and another bank which is a major corporate and investment bank. So I don't think the fact that these banks were universal was crucial to, were we radical enough? By the way, I just want to stress, we were quite radical in what we did with capital ratios. I mean, I caricatured it of the debate was between 7 and 8%, but actually, here's a fact which shocks most normal people as against financial regulators and economists, and should shock them, that in the years before the crisis, if you went to the limit of the then written down rules, you could run a bank with only 2% equity against risk-weighted assets, and you could use what were called the Basel II rules to decide that your mortgages were so good that the risk weight should only be 10%, which meant that at the limit, you could lend 100 of mortgages, finance 99.8 by some category of debt, and 0.2 by equity. Now, there weren't many banks that went all the way to the limit, but that's how we'd written the rules. That's how leveraged you actually could be. Now, what we did in the regulations, we basically changed a lot of the rules about how you set risk weights. We changed the definition of what you count as equity and capital. We took out some phonies like deferred tax, that, pretty funny forms of equity, and we changed the ratio. And if you look at everything we did, I think we probably actually increased the amount of capital that a bank requires against its activities on average 3 or 4 times. It's just that I think we should increase it about another 2 to 3 to 4 times again. So maybe we got halfway there. We didn't do nothing. But to go back to the retail wholesale split, I mean, I'm not against it. I'm not against the ring fencing of what we do in the UK, which is we're going to say within a big group like a Barclays and RBS, you have to have separate retail and wholesale units, so that if you ever do get into trouble, the regulator and the Bank of England have the capacity to say, well, I'll rescue this bit, but I won't rescue that bit, to give a little bit of, be a bit more careful in future discipline to the market. That's useful, but what I don't think you should do is, as it were, assume that all the problems arose in wholesale, or that all the problems arose in universal banks. Some of the problems arose in pure wholesale banks like Lehman's. Some of the problems arose in universal banks which did wholesale and retail like RBS, and some of them arose in banks which only did retail like Northern Rock or Bradford and Bingley. And across the world, it's very difficult to say, there was one particular set of problems and we'll fix that. There were problems all the way across the system. So I would go, yes, on what was called the Vickers Commission proposal, that we force the RBSs and the Barclays to have separate wholesale and a retail groups within them. But my primary focus would be on increasing the total amount of capital in the system, even more than the significant amount we already have done.
Okay, we're very close to the end. I've got about 5 minutes, so we're going to take 3 questions at once, and then I know that you are excellent at long, complicated answers, but 3 quick questions followed by 3 short answers.
Right.
Okay? We ready? Hands up. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Thomas Ward. As an alternative way of achieving your objective of having better capitalised banks, is there perhaps an option of introducing a new sector to banking in the UK, under which we effectively repeal the 1879 Banking Act, which, as I'm sure you'll recall, was the Act of Parliament which effectively required banks to become limited liability corporations. Yep. Because if you go back to the position of having unlimited liability of shareholders, the thing becomes self-regulating.
Right, very good question.
Okay, quick answer.
Well, sorry, I thought we were going to do 3.
No, I can see that that's not going to work because these questions are too long. I have to control it better.
So, companies, this goes back to about the 1840s, are predominantly organised as limited liability companies. If you're a director of a company and it fails, you do not pick up full liability for its debts. That is the joint stock company, the limited liability company. And most people argue this is an innovation which was pretty important to the development of capitalism. I am a director of a couple of companies, including actually a bank. And if they go bankrupt, it'll be extremely embarrassing. I might get criticised, but I will not be personally liable for all of those debts. Up until 1879, most banks were organised on a partnership basis where they were different from railway companies or hotel companies or whatever. They were unlimited liability partnerships. And some people argue, well, why don't we do that? And I guess if you did run them as unlimited liability partnerships, I suspect the freely chosen capital ratio might be considerably higher than the 20% I have suggested, because a degree of caution would enter people's behaviour. It is there as an idea. I don't personally think it's practical. I think we do have big banking organisations that are out there with big balance sheets. Suppose you said the directors of RBS are responsible for all the debts of RBS. Either nobody would become a director of RBS ever, or the only people who become directors of RBS would be very poor people, or richer people who had managed to make sure that all of their assets were in their spouse's name,
I
not
can
their
think
own.
of a lot of very poor people who would love that job.
Well, I mean, but so I don't think it's practical, but I do suggest in this. Again, it's one of those things that once you've realised that that's possible, you can go. You can go somewhere in that
I'm going to have to ask
direction.
you to try a lot harder on the short answer.
Okay, right. Sorry.
Okay, so
Right,
let's
okay,
stop there.
right, okay, two
Second
more.
question.
Should have broken your own rules.
Hugh Andrew. Keynes understood in the 20s and 30s that, and as you said at the beginning of your speech, that the corollary of chronic trade deficit countries such as Britain or chronic surplus countries such as Germany.
Yeah.
And much of your discussion has been the creation of balance in the economy. You haven't touched on, do we use a system such as Keynes's Bancor to control trade surpluses and deficits?
It's quite interesting, and this, I didn't know this when I studied economics, but it became obvious to me as I was thinking about this that Keynes's worry about the asymmetry of response between debtor and creditor nations, that if you have one country that runs a current account surplus and another comes a deficit, and then people start worrying about the deficit country will have to pull back its expenditure, but there's no matching tendency for the surplus country at that point to increase its expenditure, which is the fundamental issue which Keynes thinks about ahead of Bretton Woods, and he comes up with Bancor. Actually, that's just the international subset of the fundamental problem that we have in an economy, that you build up debts. There is somebody who owns that as an asset, right? Because for every debt, there's an asset. But when the crisis comes, the debtor feels they better cut back investment and consumption. And not only is there no offsetting tendency for the asset holder at that stage to say, well, I'll do a bit more expenditure. Actually, precisely the opposite. That's the point where the asset holder thinks, maybe debt isn't very good, so I'll cut back my investment and consumption as well. So it's very interesting, that whole debate. Is there a bigger role? Essentially, your question is there a role for international liquidity of the sort that the IMF provides? I don't think it's essential between the major economies. I think the crucial issue is, in emerging economies, have we created a bias for both a demand problem in the global economy, but also an instability problem, because in the absence of that global liquidity provision by a thing like the IMF, what emerging economies do, particularly after 1997, is say we've got to insure ourselves with massive reserves. And you get these build-up of reserves, which is then part of the story of financial instability because it produces very low real interest rates. I think we can make the system somewhat better. I think we're frankly not going to move to anything like a full Bancor system. And a full Bancor system, you only really need it in a fixed or managed exchange rate regime, not a floating exchange rate regime. The crucial issue then is the Eurozone, I think, and has enough thinking gone in within the Eurozone to how the Eurozone works as a fixed exchange rate regime, and probably not.
Okay. Mia, challenge for you. I want you to ask a question that he can answer in 2 sentences. Please.
Particularly the Financial Times. Do you think that advanced economies like the UK should be looking to much more aggressively redistributive taxation systems as a way of reducing the risk of future debt crises?
I think we need. A sentence can be as long as I like.
You could do that with a yes. You could do that with a yes or a no.
I think we need to deal with inequality by a number of mechanisms. Those include a controlled role for minimum wages, higher minimum wages, a greater degree of redistribution, and therefore I think some of the ideas of basic income guarantees for citizenships, and a level and quality of public goods which enables people to enjoy, as it were, an equality of citizenship, even if in financial terms there are large inequalities. And in order to achieve that, I find it difficult to imagine that without some significant increase in the progressivity of the tax system. Yes.
That was a yes. Thank you. I think we have to end it there, but thank you for those quick questions and long answers.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to draw, well, I'm not drawing the discussion to a close, because you're welcome to continue the discussion in the foyer and over a drink. Can I, on your behalf, thank Adair Turner? I always learn something from our speakers. I've learned an awful lot tonight, and I've read the book. But I also learnt an awful lot from the questions, actually, so thank you very much for that. So on your behalf, can I thank Adair Turner, and can I also thank Marion Somerset Webb? She didn't manage to get a word in edgeways.
I know, my question
so
is still waiting.
we're going to have to read her column for the next couple of weeks to find out what she thought of the afternoon. But thank you very much indeed. Please join us in the foyer for a drink. There will be copies of Adair's book for sale. So if you feel he hasn't explained it in as much detail as he might, then you can buy one, and I'm sure that he'll sign it for you. So thank you very much indeed.